If somebody came to you and said, I'm looking for a gateway book into epic fantasy, would you recommend this? Now, I personally would never use A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas as a gateway recommendation to someone looking to get into epic fantasy. And before anyone gets mad, I am going to explain my reasons why. That's why I'm making a video about it. I personally find this topic to be really interesting, and there's a lot of discussion around gateway books into a lot of different genres and subgenres, not just in fantasy. And I think that it's an interesting conversation because it can be very subjective, right? We all have our different favorite types of stories. We have our own favorite authors and series and even individual books that we like to recommend people when they ask us, what do I read if I want to read X genre? Now, I want to make some disclaimers before we get started because I do think that the caveats to this discussion are important. The first one, in the interest of full transparency, is that I am not a fan of A Court of Thorns and Roses. I have read the 3 first books in that series, so I do feel like I have enough of the series under my belt to be able to speak to a lot of the nuances of it and how it does or does not fit into epic fantasy, because I also read a lot of epic fantasy. The second thing that I want to say, and I think is very important, please read what you want to read. Love what you love. This is not a video where I'm going to dismiss anyone's opinions about a series that they may really love. I have no problem with that. This is just my personal opinion about this topic. Now, the other thing that I want to make a disclaimer on that I think is equally important is the fact that I have zero issue with fantasy and romance being tied together. I think that that's totally fine. And I don't even think that recommending a fantasy romance is the wrong choice to get into epic fantasy. If somebody is coming from a more romance-based background, I can think of other books that I would definitely recommend in that place. I have close friends who love this series, and that's why I read it in the first place. I read the first 3 books. I really gave it my all to try to figure out what it was about this series that they really loved. And even though it doesn't jive for me personally, this is not meant to be an exploration of subjective feelings on a specific series. So all that to say, we can still be friends, I promise. This is not meant to shame anybody. This is not meant to say that a series is good or bad. It is literally just meant to be an objective look at Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses series as a potential epic fantasy gateway. So I've personally been reading fantasy in many of its subgenres for the past over a decade now, and I've gotten a chance to read a lot of the big names in fantasy and a lot of the lesser known names in fantasy as well. I've been able to experience the work of a lot of incredibly gifted and well-known authors in the genre, including Steven Erikson, Janny Wurts, Brandon Sanderson, Joe Abercrombie, Robin Hobb, etc., etc. The list goes on. George R.R. Martin. I have read the current availability of Game of Thrones. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in this genre. I read a lot of indie fantasy. So I feel like I've really been able to get a pretty decently widely read view of the genre of fantasy and the subgenres that exist within it. Now, something that I have noticed, and the reason I wanted to make this video is because recently I've been seeing A Court of Thorns and Roses included in epic fantasy lists alongside some of the authors that I named above. Now, this is neither here nor there until I start noticing that people are recommending it as a gateway into epic fantasy as represented by the other authors I mentioned. This is where I start to have a problem with it. The idea of a gateway book is that you are giving somebody a representation of a genre or a subgenre as a whole. Now, in the broader genre of fantasy, it is so difficult. It is so difficult to recommend a gateway book because it really depends on the person's prior reading experience. It depends on what kind of storytelling they prefer. Do they want something that's a little bit more romantic leaning? Do they want something that is more of a thriller? Do they want the epic, classic Lord of the Rings style fantasy? There's so many different options. But if we're looking at epic fantasy specifically for the purposes of this video, I really start to put on the brakes when it comes to A Court of Thorns and Roses. When I first saw this stack of books, it was a picture of a stack of books with Mark Lawrence and Robin Hobb and Brandon Sanderson, and then in the middle of it was A Court of Thorns and Roses. And my first thought looking at that picture was, one of these things is really not like the others. And that wasn't because I personally didn't jive with A Court of Thorns and Roses. It was because it was so different than anything else on that list. Epic fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy. Now, we have so many subgenres of fantasy at this point, it's getting a little absurd, to be honest. But we have everything from epic fantasy to cozy fantasy to urban fantasy to fantasy romance to etc, etc, etc. There's so many different subgenres, and the beautiful part about that is that there's literally something for everyone. Understanding the separation within fantasy as a broader genre, I think, is really important when you're recommending a gateway book to someone else. Just to make an extreme example, if somebody came to me looking for a cozy fantasy recommendation, I probably would not tell them to go read Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, for obvious reasons. Now, when it comes to epic fantasy, A Court of Thorns and Roses may appear to check some boxes at first. There is magic. There are fae folk. There is a secondary world. There is this threat of a world-ending conflict. But if this is about recommending a gateway to a specific style or subgenre of fantasy, we're looking more at a ladder of progression. Where do we go after the gateway book? The gateway book is essentially designed to help someone open the door into a genre and find more of the same and more of what they're liking about that gateway book. If we use A Court of Thorns and Roses as a gateway to things like Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb and Book of the Ancestor by Mark Lawrence and even Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steven Erikson, I really don't think it works. I don't even think we're on the same ladder. Now, to explain that further, A Court of Thorns and Roses utilizes fantasy elements as the backdrop to the main focus of the series, which, from my experience reading the first 3 books, is that of Feyre's journey into the Fey Kingdom and the story of her romance between her multiple love interests. The world is fantasy, but the focal point of the series is much smaller than that, and all of those world building and plot elements outside of Feyre and her love interests are a lot less defined than the romance itself. The way I tried to break it down when I was thinking about how I wanted to organize this was, is it a romance with fantasy elements in it, or is it a fantasy with a romance in it? And in my opinion, and from my experience, the further you get into adult epic fantasy and the more widely you read within that genre and subgenre, the clearer that distinction becomes. ACOTAR's world building, politics, the world conflict definitely take more of a backseat to the romantic element of the story, which in my opinion is why it pushes more towards the romance genre than the fantasy genre. If I were to recommend a gateway book to lead someone into Robin Hobb's work or Steven Erikson's work, I would have to be able to identify elements within that story that would lead them on to those other series. It's not a book that I can see leading people further into the genre. This isn't a book that I would recommend, say, hey, you know what, read Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses, and then try Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings. I just don't see that progression happening. I think A Court of Thorns and Roses is far more likely to lead people into the romance genre or the romantasy subgenre, which is specifically romance with fantasy elements as the backdrop. Now, one of the selling points of A Court of Thorns and Roses, and one of the reasons why I think it's done so well, is because the prose is very accessible. And in that, it makes sense as a gateway book. But again, if I try to identify elements within A Court of Thorns and Roses that would push someone towards a lot of the other epic fantasy series that I've read, I really start coming up short. If I shift to another commonly utilized gateway series with similarly accessible storytelling, I would have to point to Brandon Sanderson's work in the Mistborn trilogy. This is, again, another very accessibly written book that offers a gateway into a lot of the other epic fantasy genre books. In Mistborn, the world building, the characters, the politics, the magic system, all of those things kind of find this harmonious balance within the story. The romance is there, but it doesn't take center stage. I can think of a lot of great adult epic fantasy books that have a strong romantic plotline that still are able to find that balance. The romance is important, the world building is important, everything kind of has this equality about it. And in my opinion, from the books and series that I have read within the epic fantasy genre, there's a lot more depth to all of those aspects. I think that fans of ACOTAR are far more likely to seek out other books that give them the same style as ACOTAR does, with, again, a heavy weight given to the romantic plotline of the story. Now, there's always exceptions to everything, so I am sure that there are people who have read A Court of Thorns and Roses and moved on to epic fantasy in other series. My opinion on this is coming from a generalized observation of the series of ACOTAR and the people who generally enjoy it. So in conclusion, no, I personally would never recommend A Court of Thorns and Roses as a gateway into the epic fantasy subgenre. It makes a lot more sense to me as a gateway into romance, a gateway into romantasy. And I think a big part of that is because the expectations people would have with a gateway into romantasy are definitely different than the expectations that a reader would have going into a subgenre like epic fantasy. I would love to hear from you guys in the comments. I always love having discussions underneath these videos. I would love to hear your thoughts. I really appreciate respectful commentary. So again, I'm not here to tell anybody that one series is bad, one series is good, that you shouldn't read what you want to read. I'm not saying any of that. But I would definitely love to know your comments down below. Let me know what you think, what you guys would recommend as gateways to epic fantasy in general, and what you think of the new choice to start really kind of separating romantasy out as its own very established subgenre. So anyways, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Let me know down in the comments. I hope that you guys are reading 5-star reads in whatever subgenre you have chosen as your favorite. I hope you're having a fantastic week, and I'll see you in the next video. It's so loud, you guys. Like, it's November. It's November. Why are we mowing our lawn in November? Stress. Okay, maybe. Can we try now? Shh. Okay.